Welcome to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I'm KM Weiland, and I am here to take you deep with story theory, writing techniques, and the incredible wisdom of story. I believe story is the greatest power on this earth, and that as writers, we carry the torch of wielding that power with responsibility, passion, and skill. There's no such thing as just a story. Today, it is my honor and my purpose to help you write your best story, astound the world, and maybe change your life. Hello and welcome. You are listening to Season 17, Episode 5. First, just a reminder that if you've been eyeing any of my products this month is a really good time to buy them since prices will be going up next month. You can check out all my books, such as Structuring Your Novel and Creating Character Arcs, my workbooks, as well as outlining, brainstorming, and character creation tools and courses by visiting the store on my site at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. This podcast is sponsored by, well, first and foremost, by those of you who are generous enough to support my work by donating on patreon.com. Thank you for that. Truly, you keep the podcast going. And today's episode is sponsored by Damonza.com. They are one of the leading names in book cover design right now. They have designed most of my book covers, and they are currently offering something really cool, and that is free book cover reviews. So whether you're about to publish or you're just curious to know how your cover stacks up, this review is a no-brainer. This is a fresh, informed perspective that offers valuable insight into how your book cover performs in today's competitive market. Don't miss this chance to make your book unforgettable. It's totally free, and all you have to do is visit damonza.com/review/WBA to get started. That's damonza.com/review/WBA. And now, welcome to this week's episode, 5 Proven Ways to Conquer Self-Doubt in Writing. Self-doubt is one of the biggest obstacles a writer will ever face. It creeps in at the worst moments, undermining confidence, stalling progress, and making you question whether your stories are even worth telling. Conquering self-doubt in writing isn't about eliminating it altogether. It's about learning to work with it. And the key is recognizing self-doubt for what it really is, not a stop sign, but a challenge to grow. Not long ago, Louis Senti wrote in about a personal challenge many writers face. Perhaps this is a condition that many people struggle with, but I feel quite alone. I can't seem to shut off the critical voice, the saboteur, if you will, that says things like, why bother? Nobody's interested in what you write. Or you're old and coming back to write in your 60s. Well, you don't have time to improve. It's too late. In other words, I cannot seem to shut off my rational/critical brain and fully access the childlike part of me that finds writing pure fun, pure flow. Sometimes I can't even sit down in my chair and face the keyboard. Any thoughts or ideas? If you've ever found yourself battling a relentless inner critic, the voice telling you your writing is worthless, you're too late, or you don't have what it takes, you're not alone. In fact, I'd argue all writers face this at some point, usually multiple points in their careers. The inner critic often masquerades as a rational voice. It tells us that it's just looking out for us, that it's saving us from embarrassment, failure, or wasted effort. And to a point, this is true, since the inner critic is often a highly sophisticated, and in some ways autonomous, manifestation of our inner protector, a voice we developed early in life to guide us to the safest choices. As a very young child, safety was paramount. But often this limiting protector/inner guide/critic doesn't evolve apace with our maturing capabilities. Uncalibrated, it can remain with us our entire lives, even as its advice grows progressively less helpful and increasingly self-destructive. We could argue that the out-of-control inner critic is on a mission to destroy what it sees as our greatest enemy, ourselves. Therefore, this voice is usually rooted in fear of not being good enough, of being judged, or of spending time on something that may not lead to immediate validation. One of the most important things to understand about this voice is that it is not an objective judge of your abilities. Instead, it's a deeply ingrained response to past experiences, external pressures, and personal insecurities. The more power you give it, the louder it becomes. Alternatively, the more you recognize it for what it is, the more likely you can transform it back into a force that can legitimately guide, protect, and enhance positive growth. Because self-doubt in writing, as in life, is all but ubiquitous, advice is everywhere, and most of it focuses on practical steps for either muscling past the self-doubt or building better habits to contain or redirect it. Most of this advice is good, such as give your inner critic a name. My favorite is Judgy McJudgerson. Set a timer and write anyway. Open a dialogue with your inner critic by writing it a letter. Change up your writing environment. Find a creative ritual that supports you, and remind yourself why you write. Now, I've written much in the past about dealing with the challenge of the inner critic. Some of the episodes you might want to check out include The Writer's Inner Critic, 11 Ways to Tell If Yours is Healthy, Imposter Syndrome for Writers is a Real Thing, plus the Key to Slaying It, and Judge Yourself Less, Trust Yourself More, and Write Better Stories. Today, I want to examine 5 ways to conquer self-doubt in writing that go deeper than just practical tips, so you can learn to address the underlying factors and motivations that keep the inner critic coming back time after time. Particularly, I want to examine each of the different flavors of self-doubt that Lewis articulated in his query. Tip number 1. Embrace your inner critic as a necessary archetype for conquering self-doubt in writing. You can't destroy the inner critic. You can't cut it off. You can't stuff it inside some mental compartment and forget about it. It will always come back. Why? Because it's you. Even though the toxic inner critic generally speaks in the voice of someone outside of ourselves, often an authoritarian voice, whether specific or generic, it arises from within. And the only way to get rid of it is to integrate it, to make peace with its purpose for existence, recalibrate it into better functionality, and absorb it into our higher consciousness where we can exercise control over it. In describing his inner critic, Lewis used a key word. He wrote, "I can't seem to shut off the critical voice, the saboteur, if you will." In her book, Sacred Contracts, archetype maestra Carolyn Mace posits 4 archetypes of survival inherent to every personality. One of these archetypes is the saboteur. She writes, "The saboteur archetype is made up of the fears and issues related to low self-esteem that cause you to make choices in life that block your own empowerment and success. You need to face this powerful archetype that we all possess and make it an ally." Rescued from the shadow, the saboteur/inner critic can once again become the protector it was intended to be. Instead of acting as a negative voice of self-sabotage or destruction, it becomes a neutral ally, highlighting pitfalls and recommending actionable choices. Step number 2, face your fears to overcome self-doubt and unlock your creative potential. FDR's quote has become a cliche, but it's truer than truth. We have nothing to fear but fear itself. In my own adventures, as I have circled the things I want and the fear that stands in my way, I've realized that it is rarely the thing itself that frightens me. It is dread of my own fear response that holds me back. I recently shared a quote I have found profound in my own creative, aka life journey. Everything you want is on the other side of fear. But here's another one I ran onto recently from Mary Kate Teska, which is even truer. No one ever tells you that bravery feels like fear. So the next time you sit at the page or feel dread at the thought of doing so, take a moment to lean into what you're feeling in your body. Instead of naming it fear and trying to move away from it, recognize it as your instinct toward bravery. This is your creative self in its very essence, desiring growth, transformation, experience. The very fact you are experiencing this deep inner tension and discomfort signals you are unwilling to settle for the status quo. Your inner self wants more, knows you need more. Via the very discomfort that may make you feel you are not big enough or good enough to continue, you are already proving your own profound courage. Frankly, writing is scary. I'd even go so far as to say it should be scary. At the very least, congratulate yourself for pushing your own edges. Step number 3. Recognize ebb periods. In general, writers tend to put far too much pressure on the act of writing. Yes, that part's important, obviously, but there are many other aspects of the creative process that are equally valid, and in many instances impossible to do without. When we're not actively writing every day, or sometimes even after missing just one day, our toxic inner critic's algorithm tends to lean heavily on themes of productivity equaling worth. As V.E. Schwab says, some days are typing days and some days are thinking days, but both are writing days. Just as we gain more by fully welcoming and integrating the inner critic back into a healthy role, we also achieve our best creative states when we are able to welcome and use both sides of our brain. Some people tend to emphasize intuition and emotion to the point nothing ever gets written, structured, or edited. However, many people who struggle with the toxic inner critic tend to overemphasize logic and willpower to the point they need to be reminded that sometimes not writing is actually the most creative thing you can do. Lewis wrote, "Sometimes I can't even sit down in my chair and face the keyboard." Now, each author must look within to determine whether such a circumstance is the result of running away from the fear, or instead of moving bravely into it, or whether, in some instances, a deeper and wiser voice is offering what turns out to be a good point. Very often, the resistance to sitting down to write at least partially results from the writer's unreadiness. Sometimes that unreadiness is best dealt with by simply diving in and creating your way out of it. And other times, inner wisdom dictates something is missing. Perhaps a bit more time daydreaming is necessary to fully flesh out the characters. Perhaps a bit more research is required to understand how to execute the scene. Perhaps a bit more study into the mechanics of storytelling and writing would smooth the process. Rarely is it productive to shame ourselves for legitimate feelings of not wanting to sit down and face the keyboard. Rather, allow what is to be. Take a moment to sit with it. Listen to it. There is a message of truth there if only we can learn to recognize it. Once recognized, it often transforms from an obstacle to an ally. But how do you know if you should be listening to your resistance to sitting at the keyboard or resisting the resistance and moving forward anyway? The answer is probably whichever requires more courage. Sometimes not writing can feel like the scarier option. If so, take a look at that. But if not writing feels like an escape, then turn around and sit at the keyboard once again. Wherever you are facing your fears, wherever you are feeling your own bravery, that is where the most answers will be found. Step number 4, expand the child archetype, conquering self-doubt with creative freedom. At the heart of the struggle against self-doubt is the desire to reconnect with the joy of writing and the childlike sense of play that allows creativity to flow freely. The child is another innate archetype, one intimately associated with creativity. I've written in depth about the child in my book, Writing Archetypal Character Arcs. One of the main quests of my own life has been the desire to understand why accessing my childhood experience of creativity became so much more difficult in adulthood. And most importantly, how do I get it back? That saga is ongoing for me, although I made an interesting breakthrough the other day, and if it pans out, I will share that in the future. One of the keys, however, is simply remembering tenets of childhood creativity and rewiring our well-meaning adult habits to return to them. For example, the child creates for the fun of it. No deadlines, no focus on productivity. If the child doesn't feel like creating, it doesn't. If it feels like napping or eating or crying or laughing instead of playing, that's what it does. The child does not naturally feel guilty for not creating or for creating, quote unquote, badly. The child follows its joy. The disconnect most adults experience from embodied joy is one of our greatest creative blocks. The child has no or little ego and approaches the world with the simultaneous humility and hubris of ignorance. And the child is a wide open canvas of possibility and curiosity. It sees everything as new and potentially interesting. And the list goes on. Returning to childhood is no small feat. Indeed, in Carol S. Pearson's cycle of archetypes, she begins with the childlike innocent and ends with the holy fool, the culmination of that lifelong quest to return to untamed wonder. If that culmination feels a bit out of reach as yet, and if your writing feels heavy, you can try the following practical approaches. Write badly on purpose. Give yourself permission to write nonsense, knowing you can always revise it later. Separate creation from evaluation. Draft first, critique later. Mixing the two is like trying to drive with one foot on the gas and the other on the brake. And reframe writing as exploration. Instead of thinking, I have to write something good, try, I wonder where this sentence will take me. And tip number 5, it's never too late to be creative. Lewis brings up one more important aspect of the inner critic, its ability to weaponize time against us. Writers returning to their craft after years or decades away, or those first picking up the pen after a lifetime of other pursuits, may feel an intense pressure to catch up. The critic whispers they don't have enough time to improve, that they missed their chance, or that they should have started earlier. But creativity isn't a young person's game. Many successful authors didn't publish their first books until their 50s, 60s, or later. Frank McCourt published Angela's Ashes at 66. Laura Ingalls Wilder published Little House in the Big Woods at 65. Every chapter of life brings its own challenges and opportunities. Creativity and its expression remain our most important asset at every stage of life. In each chapter of life, we are someone new. In each chapter, we have something to say that is important. The stories and archetypes of the third act of life are not the same as the stories of the first act. Experience is a writer's greatest asset. You have lived more life and gained more wisdom and perspective. You bring something to the page younger writers simply can't. So the fear that it's too late is an illusion designed by a dysfunctional inner critic to keep you from taking action. More than that, I believe everything you write adds value to the world. The very act of writing changes reality. It changes you. It's like investing advice. The best time to start is today. Although the inner critic isn't likely to ever fully disappear, it doesn't have to be in charge. You don't have to wait for permission to create, and you don't have to prove your worth before you start. Writing is an act of courage at any age, in any season of life. And the only way to silence the voice that says, why bother, is to sit down and write anyway. And that brings us to the end of today's episode. As you can see from what we've been talking about today, understanding archetypes and their shadows is a valuable resource that can help you break free from creative self-doubt and write with greater depth and confidence. My 8-week email course, Shadow Archetypes, Writing Complex Fictional Characters, explores how these deep psychological patterns shape both your characters and, by extension, the writer as well. In recognizing and working with shadow archetypes, you can uncover new layers of complexity in your storytelling that can help you transform inner obstacles into strengths. If you're interested in joining me in bringing your most compelling characters to life, you can find out more by visiting the store on my site at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. And I hope you'll stop by to join in on this subject. How do you conquer self-doubt in your writing? And what strategies have helped you stay creative even when the inner critic gets loud? And that brings us to the end of this episode of Helping Writers Become Authors. I hope you'll stop by the site for a full transcript of this episode and to join in the conversation in the comments. Tune in for next week's episode, where we'll continue to explore all things writing and storytelling. If you'd like to support the podcast, it always means a ton when you take a moment to leave a quick rating or review on Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, or Spotify. To stay updated on all the latest content I create for you, the best way is to join my mailing list at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com/mailing list. You'll also immediately gain access to lots of free resources, including my books, Crafting Unforgettable Characters and 5 Secrets of Story Structure. For real-time connection with me, more writing advice, and behind-the-scenes glimpses, follow me on Instagram at authorkmwyland. A heartfelt thank you to each one of you for your support and enthusiasm, and especially those of you who support my work on patreon.com/kmwyland. You help make my site, this podcast, and so many other resources available to writers everywhere. So until next week, keep writing, keep dreaming, and most importantly, keep being true to your stories. Thank you for being part of helping writers become authors.